when we see, it's kind of a unique year. We are seeing the Trump government implement one of the most punitive immigration policies. Of course, in the run up to the elections, the campaign has been strongly around the problem of illegal immigration, and that was the promise. And he's, of course, implementing it. How would you analyze this today?
That's a good way to start. I mean, I think I tell people that you actually should, you can follow immigration policies of this administration, but most important thing is you should listen to what he says himself. And what words come out of his own mouth are things that have really seeped into his consciousness. And he has convinced himself that he won this election on the basis of immigration. Though people here think it was inflation and economy and all that, he doesn't own it. He has actually humorously said, how many times can you say prices of apples has gone up twice? That he thinks he won this election in using immigration as a calling card. And he won the 2017 election using immigration as a calling card. So that's why you have to take him very seriously on immigration. And I think the difference about Trump 1 and Trump 2 is that the frame they're using for immigration. And the frame this time is invasion, that this is a country under attack, which then helps you put not only the immigration enforcement machinery in place, it sort of puts you all the government in place. So today, if you ask me what is the fundamental difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, is that it's not just the breadth, it's the intensity of the actions, it's the all of government approach. That's why you have Department of Defense, you have Department of Justice, you have Department of Homeland Security, you have Department of Treasury. I mean, how many times would you think that Internal Revenue Service officers, whose job is to collect taxes, are going to be deputized for immigration enforcement? Not to mention State Department, not to mention Commerce Department for using tariffs as a weapon. So that's the difference. So in that regard, this feels more like 9/11 than it felt like Trump won. Except the difference is that 9/11, we actually had an invasion. This is a made-up invasion with the 9/11 kind of policies that are being invoked across the government. So it just feels a little bit of a war footing for people like me who have done it for a long time.
Right. And we see even the Biden administration previously being under pressure on this issue. Were there any steps that the Biden administration really took, which you would like to talk about today? And then talk about what's the difference, and does it really help what,
Yeah,
President Trump is doing today?
that's a good question. I mean, I am one of the analysts in this field who think that pull factors are always more important than push factors. You know, immigration is fundamentally seen as push factors and pull factors. And we all know what the push factors are. And to me, they're constant, but they're not the same. Like, you know, there are bad conditions in these places of origin, whether it's war, it's poverty, it's health issues, it's climate, name them. Uh, they may not all be the same in the same time, in the same place, but they are incredibly high pressure ones. But the decision to make it to the border is not made by push factors. They're made by pull factors. The idea about will you make it inside the US? Once you make it inside, will it be hospitable enough for you to find an economic foothold? How long do you think you can stay in the US? I consider those pull factors. You know, not all my colleagues agree in this. So in that regard, you could say, you know, Biden got sandwiched between Trump 1 and Trump 2. And without his intending it, his administration also got defined by immigration. I mean, I think if they're honest about it, they would think they probably lost the election on the immigration ground. So just because of the proximity of these three administrations, you have to look at immigration in a much more nuanced way. And you could say that when Biden came to power, he was a pull factor himself because he had campaigned on the promise that I'm the non Trump, that we're no longer going to be this punitive restriction in this country. We are the Statue of Liberty, not the other side of it. And therefore, people who are seeking refuge, asylum, which is as close to our history as anything, they should now feel welcome. Now, people read into that it's a different day in America, and you saw numbers going up. It also is true that there was pent up feelings about COVID and all that. Push factors were present. It's also true that there were peculiar factors about Haiti and Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba. All those are real factors. But what we found in the Biden administration is that people perceived that we had a porous border. That if you make it to the border, the chances of you getting in are high. And what had happened is that the profile of immigration had changed even before Biden, but it radically changed under the Biden administration. So, to put it sort of succinctly, till 2008, our border challenge was fundamentally single Mexican males trying to sneak their way into the US looking for a job. So we have built our laws, our regulations, our infrastructure, our staffing for that era. But that era of border challenge no longer exists. It started changing in 2014 when more and more Central Americans started coming in and more families and kids started coming in, but took a full-blown change in profile in post-COVID. So what we started seeing is more and more families started coming in, more and more non-Mexican, not Central Americans started coming in, and none of them were sneaking in. They were all coming to the border, raising their hand, hi, I'm here looking for asylum. So you can change, you can see every element of the definition that I used was no longer valid. But our laws and resources, all that were designed for the old system. No wonder, therefore, you had a crisis. So you would say that any president who would come at that stage, given the change in the profile of the migrant arrivals, would have a crisis. But it so happened that this entire crisis, and since Biden came with the humanitarian face and with the humanitarian campaign, he could not, it just was not in the Biden DNA to be punitive, restrictive, sort of all of fierce government at your work to control it. So we had pretty close to a mass migration chapter. It all, unfortunately, happened to coincide with the Biden administration. So people were busy saying, therefore, we have a Biden border crisis. Literally, they called it BBC. That became the slogan. You had to say nothing else other than BBC. In fact, Republicans, I'll say, actually do not use the word immigration any longer as a problem. They say it's a border crisis because immigration is a more complicated thing. Exactly. It's a BBC. So you get defined in BBC, you can't take any part of that, any syllable of that out. And BBC, we started seeing in the, running into the election. So that's how the Biden administration, to your point, realized that something had to change fundamentally. But it did close to the end of its administration. So in the last year of the Biden administration, migration at the border went down hugely, really hugely. So that if the peak, if the high watermark of border arrivals was December 2023, 300,000 people a month came. By December 2024, his last full month, it had gone down to 47,000. I mean, that's a sea change. And it had gone down without any congressional intervention. So Biden administration was saying, oh my God, if the Congress just gave us the tools we want, we would have controlled it. They didn't get any new tools. They didn't get any new legislation, but they managed to get border arrivals under control, which then created a bigger problem. Look, if you could do this before, why, without congressional, why did you not do before? So the decreasing levels did not help change the political narrative. It actually muddied it. So that was Biden at the end. So Trump, in many ways, was handed over a gift by the Biden administration. They handed him over a border under control and a prosperous economy. But as I said, that no thank you notes were issued to that administration by this administration. So he has come in ideal sort of state at the border. So what he is doing is that he is just making it harder. To the extent that it was hard on the end of the Bush administration, they're notching it up, and they're changing the focus to the interior of the country to target people not at the border, but already here, many of whom are here for decades. That's the
Yeah.
difference.
And when we talk of course, we keep the political narrative aside. You're talking of the push and pull factor. So when we look at the pull factor, how lax has been the border patrol, the border situation on the Mexican border, where you don't have either enough manpower or the wherewithal with the forces to be able to control the kind of influx that is coming also. Is there a gap there? Is there a security gap there?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a security gap; it's a manpower gap. And the reason it's a very different kind of a manpower. What I said is that none of them are sneaking in. You need a different kind of border patrol or or machinery for control if people are sneaking in. That's trying to find people. This is not a phenomenon of people hiding. This is people seeking asylum. So you could say that our border problem is actually an asylum crisis, not a border crisis. So
Right.
if you had to, ask me, look, I'm going to give you only one chance at answering this question. What would be the remedy? In the old, I would say hire 5,000 asylum officers. That's the kind of response it needed in manpower. The border patrol would not solve that problem, but we don't have 5,000 asylum. So let's acknowledge that this has been an asylum crisis. So how do we? Because people have learned, and criminal enterprises have taught them that if you just come and invoke your right to protection under asylum, you will have to be granted a hearing, and that hearing last 4 years to get your first calendar, and then probably many more years for the process to complete. You'll be here for years with work authorization. That is a pull factor. So it's the broken nature of our asylum system that has hugely contributed to the border arrivals. So if people really want to address this problem, to treat this only as a law enforcement problem is not the way to deal with it. It's to really look at how do we reform our asylum system.
Right. So again, when we're looking at punitive action, and of course, we saw the military flight landing in Amritsar with Indian illegal immigrants handcuffed. How do you see the Indian diaspora there in the US now dealing with this situation at a time when we're also looking at more legal methods of Indian students H-1B visa coming in? How does it play out for the Indian community?
Yeah, the Indian diaspora has a bit of a schism on this. I mean, we generally think of Indian diaspora as highly educated, prosperous, model minority. That's sort of the general narrative about Indians. I think a lot of the Indian diaspora, and certainly our more educated, well off colleagues, have refused to acknowledge there's an underbelly to the Indian migrant phenomenon. And it's not just recent, it's not just last 4 years. It's been happening for at least 15 years that I know. That a large number of Indians are coming unauthorized at the border, both at the northern and the southern border, looking for, you know, better life, or some colleagues of mine would say for a life. So we know that that pressure is intact. What is also true that our legal system does not really allow too many pathways for people to come legally. Our legal system, selection system, is based on a 1952 architecture, which has really been tinkered with about 2 or 3 times since. Last time it was even touched was in 1990. I mean, that's anachronistic. Even a Trump supporter would not think that's reasonable. But that's what we have to deal with. In that legal selection system, we pay high priority to people on family-based visas and then high-skilled immigration. If you're not a high-skilled immigrant and you don't have a family connection here, the options for entering the United States are almost non-existent. So then when people are trying to find their entry to the US, they say, what's the other alternative I have? They use the asylum alternative. So the asylum alternative has actually become the, the fallback alternative for people to enter. People just have to acknowledge that. So that's why we have had an increase unauthorized migration at the border arrivals. In 2023, there were about 41,000 Indians who were apprehended at the border. That fell to about 21,000 the following year because of the Biden administration's measures. But we also had a strong pressure at the northern border. Indian migrants, actually, the Canadian-US border are the highest of any country for obvious reasons. India is a Commonwealth country. The ease of entry to Canada is easier than for many other countries. But there, the arrivals were 30,000 in 2023. That went up to about 43,000 in 2024. So ironically, that went up, and actually, it's not as surprising because when the southern border was more under control, people sought to use the northern border as a way of entry. This is also to make the point that migrants are a highly smart, highly connected group of people. They follow what's happening in the patterns of enforcement. They have almost real-time information about what border points are more porous than others, and they adjust. So therefore, make the point that this whole industry now has been highly driven by profiteers. That's part of the narrative of migration, all from globally and for the Indian migration in particular. So the diaspora doesn't want to acknowledge that either. But we have two realities about Indian migrants. We have high-skilled immigrants, prosperous immigrants, but we also have a growing number of unauthorized people. And the flight that we saw sent to Amritsar last week was just the most kind of, in optics terms, the most raw way of people to appreciate how this narrative had changed. That the imagery of unauthorized immigrants and Mexicans being sent back to Mexico, that this is a much different phenomenon, that this is a global phenomenon. Migrants from all parts of the world are coming to the US unauthorized. And sending them back to India became much more of a real performative art to me, because it was showing a militaristic response. I mean, to send a military aircraft to accomplish what a civilian aircraft could have accomplished more economically and more humanly, that tells you that the performative nature of this was more important than the outcome. And the fact that India was used as a test case to demonstrate that is telling. That India is a friendly country to the US, especially to this administration. So there you can see the militaristic nature of the enforcement machinery under Trump. They really want to create the stamp that this is an invasion, and we're using all tools at our disposal, even to invoke the image of a military response. And unfortunately, I suspect a lot of human rights violations that take place on that. The unfortunate part is that the handcuffs and the chains are part of the standard operating procedure of ICE. They have been in place for a long time. So India was not isolated for this. But just because it follows standard operating procedure does not mean that people who believe in humanity should be silenced. All human beings are entitled to dignity. And if that was violated in this case, we all should speak out against that. Leaders of sovereign countries have a responsibility to speak about that, about their own citizens. And whether that will happen here, Prime Minister Modi is coming here and tomorrow, whether that will happen as part of the narrative, we don't know. But even when people are removable, they have violated immigration laws. They should be deported, but they should be deported under humane and dignified conditions.
How do you see it impacting bilateral relations? Of course, we speak of Prime Minister Modi's visit, but going forward, these are images Indians won't forget in a hurry. Governments won't forget in a hurry, even though our response would have been different and accommodative this time. But how do you see it playing out in the bilateral relationship?
I mean, we'll see. Obviously, I mean, the fact that the flight to Amritsar has gotten a lot of coverage in the media, even in the US, a lot of coverage. Again, because it just did not fit the the traditional image of unauthorized people. That's why I think it has gotten this kind of attention here. So I think India in the past, you should know, was seen as one of the recalcitrant countries, that India would not accept migrants easily in the past. And I don't know I'm not an India expert, so I don't know what all was the response. To the extent I know that there may be some legitimate reasons, because India has to confirm that everyone who's deported in India is an Indian. So they wanted real, confirmation that everyone that was being sent to India was actually an Indian citizen and not people posing as Indian. So there was some rational basis for that. But I think the fact that it has come at the time when Prime Minister Modi is coming increases the stakes. That the Prime Minister has to make a statement about that. The Prime Minister has to make a statement about the use of military aircraft for this. Listen, India is the leader of the non-aligned movement. I mean, to say that we should accept deportees being sent in military aircraft, to me, does raise, you know, elements of sovereignty. And why that's not in the debate, I think, is worth considering. Then I think the issue is that is it being done not to be in the crosshairs of this administration? I mean, if India had been seen as a recalcitrant country, it's not surprising that the Trump administration said, if you do not want to be put on X list or Y list for tariffs or economic sanctions, you have to do Y. So the quid pro quo here, I think, will be watched. Is that what is India getting in return for accepting this kind of militaristic exercise? To me, it will also be seen as that what kind of bilateral demands the Prime Minister of India puts on other aspects of immigration. We also know that Indians are the hardest hit in terms of the backlogs of employment-based immigration and the backlogs of H-1B processing. If that becomes a part of the negotiation then you would say that India is at least using this bad optical crisis to notch up a debate about other forms of immigration, which has a rightful place in negotiations between two countries.
So we were talking of the bilateral relations, as you rightly mentioned. Of course, it's the exchange and the kind of what India gets from making this allowance, as far as the illegal immigrants are concerned, and you do see an opportunity there for the legal routes to actually be strengthened and help Indians who legally wish to work.
Yeah. I mean, that's the we all trying to figure out the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. One of the differences about Trump 2 is that he hasn't himself talked about legal immigration as a target. In 2016, when he became president, it was a constant part of his campaign theme. He would parade sort of unemployed H-1B workers H-1B unemployed computer engineers or analysts who claimed they had lost their jobs to H-1B workers. In his campaigns, that legal immigration was part of the attack on immigration policy. He hasn't done that this time. In fact, so far, we have seen no direct attempts at controlling legal immigration. And part of the reason is that his base has changed from 2016 to 2024. When he arrived in 2016, the base was all MAGA base, for whom restrictions immigration policy was a cornerstone. He has a much more diverse base now. There's MAGA base, but there's also all these corporate tycoons who cannot do without foreign workers. That's the truth. I mean, the success of their companies is hugely dependent on foreign workers. So therefore, you can see the schism that he may be willing to say harsh things and punitive things about unauthorized immigration, but he seems to actually say positive things about legal. He said that actually in his very first uh, press conference behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office when he was asked about legal. He said, yeah, they contribute. We need legal immigrants. In fact, he said we'll probably need more legal immigrants if we put tariffs in place because then people will want to come and invest in America. So he was seeing the connection. I think that sort of has made some of us of the view that legal immigration is not on the chopping block the same way as it was in Trump 1. And, H-1B workers, many of whom, predominant number of whom are Indian workers, are therefore high in that consideration. So that's likely to come up in the bilateral negotiations between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump.
When we talk of the huge influx, there are an estimated 11 million non-citizens in the US without legal status. Do you think Trump will be able to deport such huge numbers given the capacity and the legal constraints?
Yeah, I know the number is now about 13.5. The number has gone up in the last few years. But whatever that number is, he has promised mass deportation. Of course, he never defined what mass means. But anyone who knows this field knows that deporting that number of unauthorized people is simply impossible. Even deporting close to 1 million people a year is a very, very difficult task for obvious reasons. We have the Constitution at play, we have due process of law, and then we have people have to be given hearings, and that takes time. And those immigration courts are backlogged, 4 million a year. So these cases will be the back of those lines. But more important, there's capacity that there just is not enough capacity to go and arrest, especially the nature of our unauthorized population. They're not sitting somewhere in a camp. They are integrated in the communities all across the country. To locate them, find them, apprehend them without violating the Constitution is a tough job. Then to detain them is a bigger problem. The Congress gives money to ICE for detention capacity. Right now, their capacity is about 41,000 beds a night. So just to find the beds, as we like to call that in our business, is a very difficult task. That's why I think they're looking at facilities in Guantanamo Bay. They're looking at facilities at military bases. They're looking at facilities in the local jails in the country. But even if all those are employed, 1 million people a year is a really hard task. Guantanamo right now has capacity for taking 300 people. Even if we scale it up, it'll take a long time to scale it up to any meaningful level. So there are real constraints. And the other constraint is that we haven't seen economic sort of factors play here so far. That if there is going to be a mass number of people deported, its direct impact on some important industries in the country: agricultural, home care, infant care, healthcare, recreational facilities, is going to be huge. And those interests are going to speak out. And many of them actually are his supporters, are in red states which voted for him.
What do you see as long-term effects of this kind of mass deportation? Of course, it impacts, U.S. economy in different ways, as you mentioned, with different sectors being impacted. But also, how do you see it playing out in the long run, post-Trump?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of why, you have to watch each administration in itself, but you also know that it has huge impact on future policy. I think many of us will be looking at how interior enforcement has fundamentally changed. I can tell you with conviction that in the 4 years of Biden administration, and even in the years before that, even in Trump one, uh, the level of randomness of immigration enforcement wasn't what we're seeing now. Is that in the Biden administration, they were obviously unauthorized people at high level. But if you had not committed a serious violent crime, or you were not a recent voter crosser, the chances of being picked up was pretty close to zero. That had been enshrined in the Biden policy. Trump did not have had a different approach in Trump one, is that everyone is up for grabs, that all bets are off. But even then, they could not increase deportations hugely. In fact, our numbers now show at the Migration Policy Institute that Biden administration removed more people in this term than Trump administration did in its 4 years. In the Biden administration came close to the high water marks of the Bush II administration, but they never got publicity. In fact, we can tell you with some conviction even now that actual removals, the pace of removals in the first 3 weeks of the Trump administration do not match the pace of removals of the Biden administration in the last few months of that administration. Because it's easier to pick people in the streets and you can create a lot of spectacle about a raid. And you pick 3 people.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of imagery, but the output doesn't match the imagery. The output does not match the specter of what is being displayed on cameras. I mean, just on the Indian migrants that we talked about earlier, it's for the first time we have seen faces of immigrants in display.
Yes.
One of the standard operating procedures is you blur the faces of immigrants. As we blur the faces of people in the criminal justice system here, because we want to keep people's dignity. Those kinds of those rail guards were taken off at this time, which is to show that the sort of the public image of this is almost more important than the output. So we don't think that we can, even with the best of the efforts, which will be huge, they will put the best of it, the output is going to match the rhetoric at the end of the day. But that's what we'll be watching for, is the nature of the interior enforcement. I think many people in the US will now be paying attention to the conditions under which people are removed. We have taken our eyes off it. This should not have happened. There is no reason why. There is reason to believe that people should follow procedures that no one attacks an enforcement officer, that there's a risk to enforcement officer, but that can be done in a much more nuanced, individualized basis than as a mass guideline that everyone has to be shackled. There is no excuse for shackling women and children. There's absolutely no excuse for shackling pregnant women. And I think both our internal due process rights and international norms now have to be studied. I think that will be a new lesson from this. And I think finally we will see what does it mean to have the cooperation of foreign governments. We have not engaged foreign governments in this enterprise in the past. Is it what do you need a cooperation of the foreign government in the treatment office now, or can you just impose your condition on them? So those issues of norms at the international level, we haven't studied. But I think that'll be part of what we'll learn from this. But hopefully, my hope is that if after the pain and the anxiety and the fear will be in the rearview mirror, that we as a country will get back to work about what we need to fix about legal immigration. Because we do have a legal migration crisis. America needs more workers. We are an aging society. Baby boomers are retiring at 10,000 a day. We are a low fertility country. And if we want to remain the superpower of the world, especially the economic superpower, we can't accomplish that without more immigration. In fact, we can safely say that we recovered from the post-COVID recession. We recovered from the post-2008 recession only because of immigration. So we can't lose sight of the importance of immigration for the economic engine of our country. But we have no political capacity for doing that as long as we have a border crisis. So therefore, if we believe the border crisis will be brought under control, then hopefully we'll shift our attention to where it should be, which is how we reform legal immigration.
Have you, when we talk of Trump really winning with the agenda of immigration, and it obviously had a resonance amongst people who voted for Trump. Uh, Ideologically, do you see any kind of underpinning of racism here? That would drive this. Of course, Trump has said, he wants to do that, and he's declared it. What goes behind? What's the thinking, or what's the ideology behind it?
So I've said in other places, history is important for lessons. Uh, 2024 was exactly 100 years after the US put its most racist immigration policy in place in 1924. So that your viewers know, before 1924, we actually had no quota limits for coming to the United States. We had no quantitative limits for coming. There was some qualitative. We didn't admit criminals and people who would be on public charge, prostitutes, gamblers, all that stuff. We didn't have quantitative limits. And we put quantitative limits essentially to privilege Western and Northern European country migration. At that time, the concern wasn't that Asians and Latinos are coming. The concern was Southern and Eastern Europeans were coming to the US in large numbers. The mass migration of the first part of the 20th century was Southern and Italian. People were convinced, members of Congress, in highly formidable studies on purely on theories of eugenics, that one group of Europeans were intellectually and physically inferior to another group of Europeans. That was what led to the national origin quota system in 1924. It hasn't been lost on me that we had the 2024 run up to the election, 100 years of that. It hasn't lost to me that we ended the 1924 national origin quota system in 1965, when President Johnson signed the Immigration Act, which opened America to the whole world. In fact, the rise of Indian immigration in the US is completely a post-1965 phenomenon. You could say that it took the country 50 years to come to terms with the changes of the 1965 Act in the form of the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Race is not unimportant to this debate, because immigration at the end of the day is not about facts. Facts are important. Facts cannot be ignored, but it is a feeling issue. It is about the gut issue. It's about, do I feel my country is changing in a way that's uncomfortable to me? And the rate of change in that regard matters hugely. It's the rate of change in the last 25 years of our country, which has mattered in the politics of the country. And immigrants have come to places of our country which is beyond the old traditional 6 states of the country. So immigrants are now going to parts of the country which had no experience with immigration. And unfortunately, most of that has come through unauthorized immigration. That has changed the political color. People are saying, my God, how did the look and the face and the smell of our state change? And how did it change so quickly? So that is what is at play here. We cannot ignore that. But at the same time, we have to talk about facts. Look, if you're growing old in Nebraska, if you're growing old in Alabama, the people who are likely to take care of you in old age is not going to be someone born in the US. It's going to be someone born in a foreign country. That gets real. When I tell people that you really cannot convince people about immigration, that's an abstract thing. It's like economy is an abstract thing. When you interview economists to talk about economy. It's a really abstract thing. People appreciate, but the price of eggs is not an abstract thing. So in the same way, immigrants are not an abstract thing. So if you talk to people about their doctor or about their professor or about their childcare worker or their healthcare, then they begin to understand it. I think that's where we sort of missed the boat in our country on this narrative. We talk about immigration, we don't talk enough about immigrants.
Just last two questions. Of course, with the strong arm tactics that we see, we also expect more deportations to take place in the next few months, particularly in India. Do you see this kind of furor really having any kind of setting in any change in the methods adopted by the government, or do you see it actually also helping a decline in illegal immigration at the end? Do you think it's really going to have an impact that Trump really wants to bring in?
Yeah, so I'm so glad talking to an Indian journalist. One of my real peeves is there's almost no study done on immigration in India. It's a real deficit, just straight, knowledge-based deficit. I haven't seen any credible study which is in-depth, actual based on interviews of why people are migrating. So it would help. I mean, this kind of a crisis, no crisis should be wasted. I hope that Indian academics, Indian analysts, we use this as a wake-up call that we should really try to understand why people are leaving. I mean, it's that's why our only sources of information are you, reporters. There is no knowledge base. And then we get upset as to why did this happen. So I urge all Indian analysts, academics, serious thinkers to take this point as to understand why people are leaving. From the US side, as I mentioned, I'm one of those people who believe the pull factor. This is a huge change in pull factor. Migrants are they're more smart than any one of us. They know exactly what happens in Yuma, Arizona, or San Diego. They know almost exactly where the CBP officers are in what numbers on Saturday afternoon or Sunday morning. They pick and choose the places determined by what they're learning on social media. So therefore, if they know that, look, getting inside the US is not what it was like 2 years ago, obviously that's going to change the behavior. And the place to see the change of behavior is places before Mexico. I mean, see the Darien Gap, which is sort of the funnel through which a lot of migrants enter South America, Central America, then come to the US. We know that entrance to Darien Gap has gone down about 90% in the last 3 months. So it's already beginning to happen that the news circulates that things have changed. But we also know, therefore, I think the quick answer, we will see a decline in interest of people coming to the US. But people are also in watch and wait situation. Migrants are so smart. They know that this policy may change in 2 years, that there may be enough internal pressures in the US. The capacity issues, which you and I just talked about, will put a dent in the enforcement machinery. So they're always looking for new information. So whatever you see as a dip in the next 6 months may not be a phenomenon that will last for 4 years. It can change on the dime. That's what we know about the migration pattern. And the people who are most attuned to changing on the dime are not policymakers, it's your migrants. So really, if I were you, I would be really looking at what I have started calling the supply chain of push factors. Each of this, not one phenomenon. It's not like someone sitting in Los Angeles deciding how to run this criminal enterprise. There's small aspects of this. Just study how those units in this chain are operating and how they're changing their behavior. That will tell us much more about the possibility of what the pattern is going to look like 2 years from now than anything else. And I suspect immediately we'll see a big dip, but that dip may not last. So
Right.
unless people see fundamental changes in the US border policy, people will adapt.
And when you say that the immigrant is the smartest person, they're also aware of the movements of officials. Do you also see somewhere even a tiny element of corruption involved, even within the US system? If we keep asylum seekers, aside, we're also looking at a system that has traditionally over years allowed this to happen. There are supply chains, as we're talking of, and they would ultimately also have a connection within. So, is there a concern that the Trump administration has not really looked into, and we are still talking of just optics?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of immigration enforcement studies over time, frankly. I mean, um, in the Trump one administration, in the Biden administration, I have interviewed tons of uh, ICE officials over time. I've interviewed leadership in DHS. I've spent time in Mexico and on the border, and I hear a lot of stories about corruption. I have not heard any stories about US corruption as yet. It doesn't mean it may not happen. All I can tell you, I have not heard of any stories of US corruption so far. I think uh, there's obviously space for this. There's opportunity for this. I haven't heard it. So if any, I think this is sort of why your reporting really is critical. I mean, just anyone who has done in-depth interviews with these 104 people who were deported, what did you learn? If from that you learn that, yeah, US, we heard stories about Mexican officials are taking bribes all the time. We heard this about other governments. We heard this about two governments involved in the Darien Gap. Your colleague Julie Cherkovich of the New York Times has done incredibly good analysis of the Darien Gap, of the corrupt practices. I haven't heard anything about US, but if these interviews with 104 people reveals anything, that's gold. That will give lots of people in the US something to work with. So I urge, as I said, no crisis should go without its reward. I would say that you folks who have who really have access to this incredibly primary source of information, please collect it. If you want to share it with us, you're welcome to. And then we will see what policy elements grow out of that. So I know there may be possible litigation on this, and litigation sometimes does unearth a lot of stuff, but litigation with plaintiffs in a far off place is much harder than litigating people who are just across the border. So keep that angle in your mind also, that they actually may be litigation on this. And then these people become important plaintiffs. So they have to have the courage then to come and put their names to a piece of litigation against the US government. And
Mm.
what that means for US, India relations will be another important chapter to watch.
Mm.
There's just, immigration is that's why it's such an interesting story, because there's always another angle to it.
But
But
I'll
it's
just
also a
come back,
complicated story.
after meeting some of these people who've come back.
You did?
Yes, I did. So
Yeah.
I traveled to their villages, whole lot of them. They're so impoverished. It's sad to say they won't even know, the next steps to be taken. I don't think they're even aware that their human rights have been infringed on upon. So it's just as bad as that. So for them to be able to raise voice other than just talk of the kind of loans that they've taken and the distress in the families and wanting rehabilitation, possibly that's the maximum they can talk of right now. But then of course they have these horror stories, which made me ask you that question also of
Yeah.
course of the supply chains
But
and how it
even
really
off the
works.
record, did you hear any stories about corruption of US officials?
We heard that a lot of families whose children have already gone there, they're not on this flight. but they do proudly claim that it's just a matter of crossing over. So, the
Yeah,
agents, what they do
exactly.
promise is once you're there, you can go through, fine, maybe pay some money, and you would eventually, slip into the whole system. So there, I feel there is a gap.
Yeah, I mean, if you find real gaps, we would we really would like to
Yes.
know. I think, in my sense, the real gaps are because they just is not enough ability for the U.S. Uh, forces to process people. I mean, they just let people in because even to interview an individual takes about 2 hours in front of a. You get your whole biographic information, that takes an hour. That's what Trump did doing first. They would just expel people. That's what Title 42 did. Because expelling people was more expedient than even letting them go through what we call expedited removal. Because for expedited removal, you have to create a file. So if you're one CBP official in Yuma who gets 500 people on 11 o'clock morning on Saturday, he just can't deal with that. So what do? You just let them in and say, show up at an ICE facility in Los Angeles. I
Right.
think that's mostly what happened in the last few years. But seriously, if you hear of any any such real stories, it's it's imperative for us that we should know it. And I mean, they may be the poor migrants may not have the agency, but there are human rights organizations in India who should take their cases.
I'm sure it's going to pick up with more flights coming in coming months. But you really, when we heard Donald Trump again saying that he's not very happy with the pace, so does that really mean that officials will be able to keep that pace going forward?
Yeah,
And if they
it's
don't
this is
keep the
sort of
pace, where does this whole issue go at the end of it?
This is sort of where um, President Trump's understanding of the government becomes a problem. I mean, this is now becoming true for all parts of the machinery. To say that you should just, stop AID, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Is a function of AID. What does it mean to have you should have 1,300 people pick up a day? Where are they going to pick them up from?
Yeah.
And then if you pick them up from, where are you going to put them? Just simple mechanics of governance is not what drives this administration. And it's beginning to show in all aspects of its functioning. The
What's
problem is,
driving him? What's driving him? Or
I
who's
think
driving him?
well, I mean, he is, he really thinks that immigration is an important component of his agenda. He thinks that he has to be seen as promises made, promises kept. That's this stage of this enterprise. And I think at some level he truly believes it. He thinks that immigration is out of control. But it also is hugely important to his base. And he thinks that for the base, your earlier question about is race important? Sure, race is important to them. The fact that some immigrants are better than others is part of that ethos. But I think he also believes that the government is not functioning, which is, to me, he may have issues about why government is not functioning, but you really cannot just make things up. You cannot just say, give me 15,000, unauthorized people. That's where I understand there's a difference between his narrative and the ability to accomplish it. I mean, just to, he has never thought through where are the beds coming? So that level of interest he doesn't have. And I think in the Trump one, there were enough people in the administration who would tell him, Mr. President, we can't do that. In this administration, he's surrounded by people who are trained not to say that. That's where I think it sounds much more chaotic than Trump once sounded. Is that there are no people who talk back about issues of expediency and what is possible and what's not. And they're not people with experience. Like if the government, people who work for you themselves don't have the experience, how are they going to tell you what works and what doesn't?
Exactly.
So it's a very, very unfortunate, chaotic situation, but we'll see where it lands. And
Right,
it's
right.
unfortunate that poor immigrants are the first line who are facing the brunt of this approach. It is a hammer approach as against, a more nuanced way of accomplishing the same. I mean, Biden, as I said, removed more people, but we never heard about it. It was done quietly, subtly, with cooperation of the governments. No press releases issued. In this administration, issuing the press release is more important than accomplishing the mission. That's your difference.